Think about the last time you used the word good.
Oh, I mean, people probably use it 50 times a day.
Exactly. You probably threw it around effortlessly, without a second thought. You might have said you just bought a good poster.
Right.
And then later, you might have watched a match and remarked on a really good tennis player.
Yeah. Or maybe over dinner you described your best friend as a good person.
Yes, exactly. We use this single four-letter word to evaluate like an appliance making your breakfast, the athletic prowess of a total stranger, and the deep moral fiber of someone you love.
It's wild when you actually stop and think about it.
It is.
Yeah.
Because what is the hidden thread connecting those three things? I mean, if you actually pause and force yourself to define what property you are assigning to the toaster, the athlete, and the friend, well, the whole concept just starts to unravel.
It really creates this fascinating linguistic and philosophical vertigo, I think.
Vertigo is a great word for it.
Right. Because when we assume we know what these everyday words mean, words like good or correct or ought, we are usually just operating on pure instinct.
We just feel it.
Yeah, but Judith Jarvis Thomson, in her monumental work Normativity, decided that instinct just wasn't enough. I mean, she set out to completely map the architecture of human judgment.
Which is a massive undertaking.
Massive. She wanted to prove that our normative thoughts, the way we evaluate the world and direct our actions, they aren't just these mystical feelings floating up in the clouds.
Right.
They are deeply mechanically woven into the factual reality of the universe.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. For you listening right now, we are going to take your everyday judgments, strip them all the way down to the studs, and rebuild them using Thomson's incredibly rigorous framework.
Because the moment you understand how this actually works, I mean, it completely rewires how you evaluate everything.
From your career choices to your moral obligations. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to start, I think we have to divide the world of judgment into two distinct buckets.
Yeah. Thomson argues that all normative judgments fall into two major subkinds.
Okay, let's unpack those.
First, you have evaluative judgments. And these are just assessments of value. For instance, determining whether an umbrella is a good umbrella or whether a singer is a good singer.
Got it. Assessing value.
Right. Then on the other side, you have directive judgments. These don't just assess, they actually instruct or command. They deal with what someone ought to do or what a thing must do.
So an example would be?
Like saying, Smith ought to be kind to his brother. That is a directive.
Okay, so evaluation is about assessing value, and direction is about guiding action. Let's tackle the evaluative side first, because to really appreciate Thomson's genius here, we have to understand the huge mess she was trying to clean up.
Though it was quite a mess.
Yeah, we have to talk about a philosopher named G.E. Moore and the absolute chaos he unleashed back in 1903 with a book called Principia Ethica.
Chaos is right. Moore introduced an idea that really dominated the 20th century. We can just call it the goodness thesis.
And this is the idea that goodness is like a physical thing.
Essentially, yeah. He argued that there is a standalone universal property in the universe called goodness. And he believed that every single good thing, whether it's a good sunset, a good person, or a good toaster, shares this one universal property.
See, I have a really hard time accepting that, and I think anyone listening would too if they push on it for even a second. Moore is basically suggesting that goodness is like a physical substance.
Like a literal ingredient.
Yeah. It's like thinking the word fast is a magic powder sprinkled on both cheetahs and sports cars. But wait, let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure, jump in.
If I pet a good dog and then later I eat a really good slice of pizza, my brain is releasing the exact same dopamine. I mean, I feel a sense of pleasure from both of those things. Doesn't that sort of imply they share a common property?
I get why you'd say that, but let's separate your internal biological reaction from the external reality of the objects themselves.
Okay, fair.
Because Moore wasn't talking about human dopamine. He was talking about the actual factual makeup of the world. He provided a very specific rationale for this. He suggested that for a toaster to be a good toaster, it actually must possess two entirely separate properties.
Okay, what are they?
First, it must possess the property of being a toaster. And second, it must possess the universal property of goodness.
So it's literally an additive equation. Toaster plus goodness equals good toaster.
That was exactly his claim. He also promoted this alternate rationale, which is the idea that when we just point at something, say a painting on a wall, and simply say, that is good, we are successfully ascribing this floating universal property of goodness directly to the object.
Without any further context.
Right, without any further context.
Okay, this is where Thomson steps in and uses grammar of all things, to dismantle a century of philosophy, which I just love.
It is brilliant.
She leans on the work of a linguist and philosopher named Peter Geach. And Geach pointed out that we have to look at how adjectives actually function in the English language.
Right, he divided them into two categories, predicative and attributive.
Let's trace Geach's logic here because it completely undermines Moore's whole additive equation thing. Let's start with a predicative adjective, like the word red.
Okay, think about a red car. If you have a red car, and that car happens to be a Mercedes, basic logic dictates that you have a red Mercedes.
Right. The property of being red transfers perfectly. It is a predicative property.
Exactly. It's just a red thing that also happens to be a Mercedes. The redness doesn't rely on the car to exist as a separate concept.
Now, compare that to an attributive adjective, like the word big. I want you to imagine you have a big mouse as a pet.
Okay, a big mouse.
And a mouse is obviously a mammal. So based on that, can you logically conclude that you have a big mammal?
Absolutely not. A big mouse is still a completely tiny mammal.
Right. The logic completely breaks down because the word big doesn't exist in a vacuum. It only means something relative to the noun it's attached to.
It attributes scale based on the specific category, the kind of thing that it's actually describing.
And Geach's revelation, which Thomson totally champions, is that the word good functions exactly like the word big. It is strictly an attributive adjective.
This is such a crucial point. Suppose you have an athlete who is a very good tennis player, and that same person also happens to play chess on the weekends.
Okay.
Following Moore's logic, if this person possesses the property of tennis player, the property of chess player, and this universal additive property of goodness, they should automatically be a good chess player.
But they might be absolutely terrible at chess. Being a good tennis player does not magically transfer over.
Which proves Moore's rationale is fundamentally false. Being a good toaster isn't some weird conjunction of toaster and goodness. There is no standalone, free-floating property of pure goodness anywhere in the universe.
So whenever you say that is good, you are always inevitably speaking within a specific context.
Always. You are saying it is good at crossword puzzles, good for the economy, or good in a Shakespeare play.
But what about that alternate rationale? What if I'm at the grocery store, I point to a melon, and I just say, that is good? I mean, I'm not adding any context out loud.
You might not be saying the context out loud, but it is heavily, heavily implied by your environment. You mean it is a good melon.
Oh, I see.
Thomson illustrates how absurd the alternative is. Imagine if the grocer looked at you and said, well, I don't know if it's a good melon. I just meant it possesses the universal property of a good thing.
You would think the grocer was totally losing their mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It perfectly mirrors Thomson's analogy about the word big. If I show you my pet mouse on Wednesday, and it's huge for a mouse, you say, wow, that is big. You are evaluating it as a mouse.
Right, but if we go to the Natural History Museum on Thursday and stand that exact same mouse next to a taxidermy elephant, you'd point to my mouse and say, that is small.
And the mouse didn't physically shrink overnight. And it certainly doesn't possess the universal mystical properties of both bigness and smallness simultaneously.
So the real problem with 20th century philosophy was that all these thinkers became completely obsessed with trying to measure this phantom property of goodness.
Yes, because they thought of it as a standalone thing. They couldn't find it under a microscope or weigh it on a scale. It became this epistemologically dark, supernatural aura.
Which is so frustrating. But Thomson drags philosophy back to reality by introducing the concept of kinds.
Right, let's use the symbol K to represent a kind of thing. Thomson argues that certain kinds inherently set their own standards for what makes them good.
Yeah.
She calls these goodness-fixing kinds, or KGF.
Let's use the toaster again to ground this. A toaster is a specific kind of thing. It's an artifact.
Like it.
It was designed and manufactured by humans with a very specific, undeniable purpose, which is to toast bread.
So because of what a toaster fundamentally is, the standard for evaluating it is already built into its very existence. It has to toast well.
Another really compelling example she uses is a beefsteak tomato.
I love this one.
Yeah, because it isn't a machine, you know? It doesn't have a mechanical function with gears and wires, but it is a biological entity bred by humans to be large, fleshy, and tasty at maturity.
So the very nature of being a beefsteak tomato sets the standard for its evaluation. If it is large and tasty, it is a good beefsteak tomato. The kind actually fixes the goodness.
But this doesn't apply to everything, does it? Like, what if I pick up a random pebble off the driveway, or look at a smudge of ink on a piece of scrap paper? Is there a built-in standard for a good pebble?
There isn't. The definition of a pebble, A small, smooth, rounded stone carries no inherent standard of performance or purpose or ideal state.
I could totally argue that, though. What if I lost a piece from my chess set and I desperately need something to replace a pawn? I pick up a stone and say, this is a good pebble.
Ah, but notice your phrasing there. You aren't saying it is a good pebble in a vacuum. You are saying it is good for replacing a chess pawn.
Oh, right. I had to add that.
You had to introduce an external human interest to evaluate it at all. The pebble itself did not provide the standard. Therefore, pebble is not a goodness-fixing kind. You can't evaluate it unless you artificially attach a purpose to it yourself.
For anyone listening, the reason this distinction is so incredibly liberating is that it demystifies our judgment. When you review a financial portfolio and call it good, or you evaluate a piece of code as good, you aren't trying to detect some invisible divine aura.
No, not at all.
You are simply comparing the object against the factual physical reality of what that thing was created to be.
And by doing that, Thomson successfully pulls goodness right out of the metaphysical clouds. But solving that problem immediately forces her to confront a different group of thinkers, the expressivists.
Oh boy, the skeptics.
Yeah, these were the skeptics who looked at the failure to find a physical goodness particle and drew this very radical, highly cynical conclusion.
Expressivism is championed by philosophers like Simon Blackburn. And as I understand it, they look at the world and say, okay, physics can detect gravity, biology can detect cellular mitosis, but no scientific instrument can detect duty or goodness.
Right.
So they conclude that when we use normative language, when we say stealing is bad or that is a good umbrella, we aren't stating facts about the world at all.
That is the core of their view.
Yeah.
Expressivists argue that normative language is merely a vehicle for expressing subjective personal attitudes.
They're just emotions.
Exactly. When you say a toaster is good, you aren't describing a factual property of the appliance. You are just expressing a favorable emotion toward it. It's the philosophical equivalent of cheering for a sports team. Yay, umbrellas. Or boo, stealing.
Thomson attacks this with a brilliant thought experiment about cross-temporal judgment.
It's so good. Let's paint the picture for them.
Okay, imagine it is the year 1900. There is a specific typewriter on the market. Let's call it Teddy. It has crisp keys, a solid carriage return, fresh ribbon. Everyone in the year 1900 looks at Teddy and says, Teddy is a good typewriter.
Okay, now, fast forward a century. We find Teddy sitting in a dusty attic in the year 2000.
Right.
The keys are incredibly heavy compared to a modern laptop. It jams if you type too fast, and it obviously offers no backspace. A modern person looks at Teddy and says, Teddy is a bad typewriter.
And the expressivist jumps on this scenario triumphantly. They say, look, the physical object, the metal and the ink, did not change at all. Teddy is physically identical to how it was in 1900.
Right, nothing physical changed.
So they argue the only thing that changed was human attitudes. Therefore, goodness is just a shifting human attitude, not a fact about the typewriter.
It sounds so convincing until Thomson points out a massive blind spot in their reasoning. The expressivist is completely ignoring the shifting baseline of the comparison.
Explain that.
Well, Teddy didn't lose some invisible property of goodness. Teddy is still a good typewriter. For a typewriter made in the year 1900.
Because the standard for the kind evolved as technology advanced.
Precisely. If a person in 1900 said, Teddy is a good typewriter, and what they secretly meant was, Teddy is the pinnacle of typing technology for all eternity, well, then they were factually incorrect.
Obviously.
But if they meant, Teddy is a good typewriter for our current era, that statement remains an objective fact today. The baseline shifted. The expressivist confuses a change in the context of the kind with a change in subjective emotion.
That makes so much sense. But the expressivists have another major defense mechanism. They lean heavily on something called the wants generalization, or the containment thesis.
Yes, this is a big one.
They essentially argue that it is psychologically impossible to truly believe something is good without simultaneously desiring it.
They literally believe that normative belief contains desire. Yeah. Under this thesis, you cannot genuinely hold the belief that a restaurant is good without harboring a secret want to eat there. To the expressivist, the belief is just a masked craving.
Thomson crushes this with an incredibly relatable scenario. I like to call it the birdcage refutation.
Go for it. Lay it out.
Imagine you're walking down the street, waiting for a friend to finish an errand, so you kill some time by wandering into a pet store.
Okay. Pretty normal day.
You find yourself in the bird aisle, staring at a large wrought iron birdcage. You inspect the hinges, you notice the bars are spaced perfectly so a bird can't get stuck, and you see a really cleverly designed removable tray for easy cleaning.
So you're gathering evidence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Based on elementary observation and logic, you form a factual belief. You say to yourself, this is a good birdcage.
You have successfully evaluated it against the standard of its kind. Now, the crucial question for the expressivist. Do you want to buy it?
No, I don't even own a bird. I am mildly terrified of birds, honestly. I have absolutely zero desire to buy, own, or interact with this cage.
Right.
I can objectively recognize its goodness based on its functional design without feeling a single ounce of desire.
The expressivists will try to salvage their theory here by arguing that you must have some microscopic, latent desire to buy the cage, but your desire to save money simply overrides it.
Which just feels like they are inventing invisible psychology to protect a flawed theory.
It is a totally desperate defense, and it actually traces back to a fundamental error made by the philosopher David Hume.
Oh, Hume.
Yeah, Hume famously insisted on a rigid divide between cognition and motivation. He argued that a belief, which is just a cognitive recognition of a fact, cannot, on its own, cause a want or an action.
So what do you think caused it?
He thought you must always have a pre-existing separate desire to trigger the want.
Let's make sure we really understand Hume's error because it sounds a bit dense. Let's use an example.
Let's imagine a man named Bert. Bert decides he wants a red umbrella. He walks into a department store, scans the aisles, and sees an umbrella named R&D.
Okay.
He looks at it and forms the belief. This umbrella is red. According to Hume, that cognitive belief did not cause Bert's sudden want to buy that specific umbrella.
Why not?
Hume would argue that Bert's pre-existing desire for redness is doing all the causal heavy lifting.
So it's like saying a spark caused an explosion, but Hume is screaming, no, the room being filled with gas caused the explosion. And Thomson is saying, they both contributed, you're just misunderstanding how background conditions work.
That is a perfect analogy. The gas in the room is just the background condition. Thomson points out that we accept background conditions in physics all the time.
Right.
A rock hitting a window causes the window to break. The fragility of the glass didn't cause the break. The fragility was just the background condition that allowed the rock to cause the break.
So Bert's pre-existing desire for a red umbrella is just the fragile glass. It's the background condition. His new factual belief, this specific umbrella is red, is the rock.
Exactly.
The belief absolutely can cause the want, provided the background conditions are right.
And by proving that beliefs can cause wants, Thomson shatters the containment thesis. Believing a birdcage is good doesn't magically contain a desire to buy it.
You can objectively evaluate the goodness of an object based on its goodness-fixing kind, entirely independently of your personal desires or emotional attitudes.
Exactly right.
But wait, I want to push back on the language here just a little bit. If I say out loud that is a good umbrella, aren't I praising it? And isn't the act of praising something inherently showing a positive attitude toward it?
You are conflating a linguistic action with an internal psychological state.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Thomson makes a vital distinction between performing a speech act and holding an internal attitude. If I utter the words DRY is a good umbrella, I am engaging in the speech act of praising it.
Right.
That is simply a semantic reality of how the word good functions in a sentence. But my internal attitude could be completely, totally different.
Give me a scenario where those two things don't align.
Suppose I have an enemy, and my enemy is about to walk into a torrential hurricane. I see an umbrella on the table. I happen to know this umbrella is fundamentally broken, the latch is faulty, and it will collapse the second a gust of wind hits it.
Okay, I see where this is going.
I look at my enemy and say, you should take this one. It's a very good umbrella.
That is incredibly devious.
I am performing the speech act of praising the umbrella, but my internal attitude toward the umbrella is entirely negative. I think it's a piece of junk. The speech act of praise does not guarantee a favorable internal attitude.
That makes total sense for inanimate objects, but what happens when we evaluate people? Thomson introduces a distinction between praising someone's simpliciter and praising them qua.
Yes.
Let's break this down because I struggle with applying the word good to something harmful. What if we talk about a good virus or a good assassin?
It feels paradoxical, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
How can an assassin be good? This is where the simpliciter versus qua distinction clarifies everything. Simpliciter means evaluating something simply as a human being or as a general entity.
And qua.
Qua means evaluating something in its capacity as a specific kind of specimen.
So if I say he is a good liar.
You are simultaneously doing two very different things.
Yeah.
You are dispraising the person's simpliciter.
Hmm.
As a human being, chronic lying is a moral failing. It is a bad thing to be a liar. But you are praising them qua liar. Meaning, if we look at the specific goodness-fixing kind called liars, this person is a highly effective, highly proficient specimen of that kind.
That clears up so much cognitive dissonance. You can evaluate the proficiency of a specimen against its specific functional standard, while simultaneously holding a broader moral evaluation of whether that standard should even exist in a human being.
Exactly. And this structural understanding of how we evaluate kinds sets us up for a fascinating progression.
How so?
Well, if goodness is tethered to specific kinds, how do we handle comparisons? How do we measure betterness?
Right, because if there is no standalone property of goodness and there's no such thing as a good pebble, can there be a better pebble?
Logically, no. Thomson shows that the relation better than is an attributive relation functioning exactly the same way good functions as an attributive adjective.
So you can't just be better in a vacuum.
Right. There is no standalone state of being better. You cannot look at a toaster and a pebble and say the toaster's a better thing. You can only compare within the bounds of a kind. One toaster can be a better toaster than another.
So what is the actual metric for comparing two toasters? If one is better, it must possess more of something.
It possesses more virtues.
When you say virtue, my mind instantly goes to ancient philosophy, courage, stoicism, justice, honesty. But Thomson is using this term in a much more mechanical, functional way, isn't she?
She strips the word of its purely moral baggage entirely. Thomson defines a virtue in a kind as a property that a member of that kind must have to be good. It is just a functional requirement.
So sharpness is a virtue in a carving knife.
Yes. Good eyesight is a virtue in a seeing-eye dog. Fast, accurate typing is a virtue in a stenographer.
But wait, I was reading this section closely, and Thomson actually catches a flaw in her own logic here, doesn't she?
She does, yeah.
She initially says a virtue is something a kind must have to be good. But then she brings up a mathematician. Let's say I had a high school math teacher. He was reliable, he taught calculus clearly, he graded fairly.
Sounds like a good math teacher.
Exactly, he was a good math teacher, but he couldn't solve the Riemann hypothesis. He wasn't capable of truly great, groundbreaking mathematics. Are you telling me that because he lacked the capacity for true greatness, he lacked virtue?
You've hit on the exact paradox Thomson realized she created. If we say a property is a virtue, only if a kind must have it just to be considered good, the definition is way too weak. Competence is enough to be good.
Right.
But a virtue should represent something higher. So Thomson refines her definition. She states that a property is a virtue in a kind if a member of that kind is as good a K as a K can be, only if it has that property.
Oh, wow. That shifts the baseline from bare minimum competency to the absolute ceiling of potential.
Precisely. A carving knife is as good a carving knife as it can possibly be, only if it possesses the property of extreme sharpness.
I see.
A mathematician is as good a mathematician as they can possibly be, only if they possess the capacity for great, original mathematical insight. The virtue is the ultimate ceiling for that specific goodness-fixing kind.
For everyone listening, think about how profoundly this applies to your daily life. When you are managing a team and writing an employee performance review, or you're testing out a new piece of software, or even critiquing a movie you just watched, you are instinctively applying Thomson's framework.
You really are.
You aren't just asking if it's good based on a feeling. You are checking it against the virtue properties inherent to what that thing is meant to be at its absolute best. A thriller movie is as good a thriller as it can be, only if it possesses the virtue of suspense.
Recognizing this architecture gives us a tremendous amount of intellectual clarity. We stop debating subjective emotional feelings, and we start debating whether an object genuinely possesses the specific virtues dictated by its kind.
But Thomson realizes that goodness doesn't cover everything. There is a massive pivot in the book here, because not every judgment we make is about whether something is good. Sometimes we judge things based on whether they are correct.
This is a subtle but absolutely vital distinction in normativity. Thomson introduces a new category called correctness-fixing kinds, or KCF.
Let's use an example.
Let's consider a map of the London Underground. We wouldn't typically look at it and call it a good map in a moral or even a highly evaluative sense. Our primary concern is just, is it a correct map?
Right. Does it accurately reflect the factual geography of the subway tunnels?
Exactly.
Or like a spelling bee. If a child spells the word chiaroscuro, we don't judge the spelling as good or bad. We judge it as correct or incorrect against the standard of the dictionary.
Exactly. These kinds, maps, spellings, performances of musical scores, they set standards for correctness. And this framework applies heavily to human actions, specifically speech acts.
Speech
Yeah.
acts.
When I assert a statement, I am performing an act that is subject to a standard of correctness.
Thomson splits this into two fascinating layers, which completely changed how I view being wrong, honestly. She divides it into internal correctness and external correctness. Let's start with external.
External correctness is straightforward. It is entirely dependent on objective reality. A statement is externally correct if the proposition is true.
So if I stand outside, say it is raining, and water is indeed falling from the sky, my assertion is externally correct.
Yes. But internal correctness is entirely different. It judges the act of asserting based on the evidence available to the speaker at that exact moment.
Let's create a scenario to illustrate this. You are inside a windowless office. You check 3 different highly reliable weather apps, and they all show a severe thunderstorm directly over your building.
Okay, good evidence.
You even hear loud rumbling through the walls. Based on this overwhelming evidence, you assert to your coworker, it is raining outside. You have carried out the act of asserting flawlessly according to the rules of evidence. Your act is internally correct.
But then a coworker opens the door, and it's completely sunny.
Mm.
The weather apps were hacked, and the rumbling was just construction on the roof.
In that case, your statement was externally incorrect because the proposition was factually false. But Thomson would argue your assertion was still internally correct. You followed the proper evidential rules.
I love this because it separates the outcome from the process.
Yeah.
You can be completely wrong, but still have acted correctly based on the data you had.
Exactly.
But this brings us to a massive clash in philosophy regarding something called the knowledge rule, championed by Timothy Williamson.
Williamson is a major figure, and he argued for a very strict, uncompromising normative constraint on human speech. He posited the knowledge rule, which states you must assert a proposition P only if you know E to be true.
And Thomson uses a brilliant scenario, the lottery example, to dismantle this completely.
I'm going to use an analogy to make sure I understand the stakes here first.
Huh.
Imagine a soccer referee who blows the whistle and calls a foul on a player. The ref didn't actually see the foul happen. His view was totally blocked. He just blew the whistle because that specific player has a history of fouling, so it was highly probable.
Right.
It turns out, video replay shows the player did commit a foul. The ref was right, but he blew the whistle based on probability, not knowledge.
That is a perfect parallel to the lottery example. Let's map it onto Thomson's scenario. You hold a lottery ticket. The drawing has just taken place, but neither of us has actually seen the results on television.
Okay, I have my ticket.
I know the statistical odds of you winning are 1 in 100 million. Based entirely on that overwhelming probability, I look at you and assert as a flat fact, your ticket did not win.
According to Williamson's knowledge rule, since you only had probabilistic evidence and didn't know the result with absolute certainty, you violated the rule, you acted incorrectly.
But let's look at the outcome. 10 minutes later, the numbers are announced. Your ticket was a loser.
So you were right.
Thomson demands we be incredibly precise with our normative language here. Was your assertion correct? Externally, yes. The ticket lost, the proposition was true. But did you have a right to assert it as a fact?
If I were the friend holding the ticket, I'd be furious. I would say, you didn't know that for sure. You shouldn't have said it.
And Thomson would agree with your anger. She would say, you ought not have asserted that the ticket did not win.
But she doesn't think the assertion was incorrect.
No, she flatly refuses to concede that the assertion itself was incorrect. It was externally correct because it perfectly aligned with reality.
This is a huge distinction. She is proving that correctness and ought are not identical. They do not perfectly overlap. You can do something correctly, even if you ought not to have done it.
The architecture is distinct, just like a chess match. You can make a move with your knight. It is a completely legal, correct move according to the rules of chess.
Right.
However, strategically, you ought not to have made it because it leaves your king exposed to checkmate. We cannot mush all these normative concepts. Must, ought, correct, good into one giant, blurry conceptual pudding. They have distinct mechanisms.
Okay, so we've established how correctness works for physical actions, like asserting a sentence or moving a chess piece. But what about the internal world? What about mental states like believing? Is a belief subject to normativity?
This is heavily debated. A popular slogan in philosophy is truth is normative, or belief is normative.
What does that mean exactly?
Many thinkers argue that if a proposition is true, you inherently ought to believe it, or that holding a true belief is inherently a good thing.
But Thomson rejects this entirely.
She does. She points out that the mental state of believing is not a goodness-fixing kind. There is no such thing as being a good specimen of a belief.
If I believe that the sky is blue, that belief is true, but it doesn't possess a favorable evaluative property the way a sharp carving knife does. It just aligns with a fact.
Correctness in belief is strictly an objective matter of whether the proposition is true. It has absolutely nothing to do with whether it is subjectively rational for you to hold that belief.
Wait, really?
Yeah, for example, if you believe the stock market will crash tomorrow solely because a fortune teller reads your palm and miraculously the market does crash, your belief is correct. Your methodology was wildly irrational, but the belief itself is objectively correct.
Does this apply to other feelings, like fearing, admiring, or trusting?
It functions exactly the same way. What is a correct trusting? It simply means that the object of your trust factually holds the traits you're relying on.
Okay.
If you trust a local bank with your life savings, and that bank is financially solvent and managed by honest people, your trust is correct.
It doesn't mean the feeling of trust in my chest possesses some magical goodness. The bank is just trustworthy.
The correctness lies entirely in the factual reality of the object, the bank, not in the normativity of your mental state.
This sets the stage beautifully for part 5, where we have to completely rethink the concept of reasons. Because in the 1950s, moral philosophy took a massive detour. Thinkers like T.M. Scanlon led what became known as the turn to reasons.
Scanlon and his contemporaries started arguing that normativity is entirely built on reasons for action. They posited that to call an object valuable or good simply means that the object possesses properties that provide us with reasons to behave in certain ways toward it.
Right.
They tried to build the entire house of human judgment on the foundation of reasons.
But Thomson argues they built the house upside down. To understand her critique, we have to grasp the difference between subjective reasons and objective reasons.
A subjective reason is entirely dependent on what a person believes, regardless of reality. Let's use a slightly dark example.
Okay.
Suppose a man named Smith deeply wants his neighbor Jones dead. Smith finds a box of chocolates on the counter and for some reason forms the belief that they are laced with arsenic. Subjectively, based on his internal goals and beliefs, Smith has a reason to give the chocolates to Jones.
But what is the objective reason?
Objectively, the chocolates are totally safe. They're just regular chocolates. Therefore, factually, there is zero objective reason to give them to Jones if the goal is to kill him.
So objective reasons rest on the physical, factual reality of the universe, not on Smith's flawed, subjective beliefs. This leads us to my absolute favorite thought experiment in the entire book. It's the billionaire example, and it perfectly illustrates the psychological trap of confusing pragmatic reasons with real, evidential reasons.
It is a devastating critique of how we misuse the word reason. Set the stage for us.
Okay, imagine you are walking down the street and an eccentric billionaire pulls up in a limousine. He rolls down the window and makes you an offer. He will wire $1 billion into your bank account on one condition.
What's the condition?
You must genuinely, truly deep down believe that the earth is flat. You can't just pretend. You can't just say it out loud. You must harbor a sincere psychological conviction that the earth is a flat disk.
Now, here's the philosophical trap. Does that $1 billion give you a reason for believing the earth is flat?
The intuitive gut reaction answer is, of course it does. It's $1 billion. That's a massive reason.
But Thomson exposes this as a fatal category mistake. The money is a pragmatic reason to want to believe the earth is flat.
Oh, I see the distinction.
It gives you an enormous incentive to try to brainwash yourself, to seek out conspiracy videos, to isolate yourself from science. But the money itself is not a reason for believing the proposition.
Because reasons for believing a fact require actual evidence.
Precisely. A reason for believing the earth is flat would be chartering a boat, sailing to the edge of the world, and taking a photograph of the water falling off into the void. The billionaire's money provides zero geographical evidence.
Right.
Conflating a pragmatic incentive to desire a belief with an evidential reason for holding a belief causes massive confusion.
So how does this dismantle Scanlon in the 1950s turn to reasons?
It attacks the central dogma of that era, which Thomson refers to as slogan I. Slogan I states what A ought to do is what there is most reason for A to do. It implies that reasons are the fundamental building blocks that generate our obligations.
And Thomson flips this completely upside down.
She argues that directive statements about what we ought to do not rest on reasons for action. It is the exact opposite. Reasons for action exist because of overarching directives.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this. The standard 1950s view says, I see a building on fire. The fire provides a reason to run. Therefore, the reason generates the fact that I ought to run. Thomson says that logic is backward.
Entirely backward. Thomson's architecture says you are a human being.
Yeah.
A fundamental directive of being a human is that you ought to avoid burning to death because burning to death makes you a physically defective human.
Wow, okay.
Because that overarching directive already exists in your biology, the presence of the fire provides a reason to run. The directive is the bedrock. The reason is merely the specific environmental circumstance that triggers the directive.
Wow. That completely shifts the center of gravity in philosophy. The reason doesn't generate the ought. The ought is already baked into the kind of creature we are.
Which brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most profound section of her work. We have to unpack that heavy-loaded word, ought. What are directives, truly?
To get to the bottom of ought, we have to defeat one last enemy, which is relativism. This is the pervasive idea that what you ought to do depends entirely on which set of rules you happen to be following at the time. I want to use the ultimate chess dilemma to illustrate how dangerous this thing is.
It's a perfect stress test for relativism. Set the board.
We have a chess player named Alfred. Alfred is in the middle of a tense match, and his opponent puts him in check. According to the strict, documented rules of chess, to save his king, Alfred ought to move his queen to block the attack.
A clear, unambiguous, rule-based directive.
But suddenly, a villain bursts into the tournament hall holding a detonator. The villain screams, Alfred, if you move your queen, I will blow up the city of Chicago. You must move your bishop instead.
Talk about high stakes.
Right. So now, according to the laws of morality and preserving human life, Alfred ought to move his bishop.
The relativist looks at this terrifying scenario and just shrugs. They say, well, both statements are true. Relative to the rulebook of chess, Alfred ought to move the queen. Relative to the rulebook of morality, he ought to move the bishop. Therefore, there is no objective truth to what Alfred simply ought to do.
They treat morality and a board game like two equal but conflicting filing systems.
But Thomson points out that this relativistic view destroys the very concept of asking for advice. If Alfred turns to you in a panic and asks, what ought I to do? He isn't asking you to recite the rules of chess. He knows how the knight moves.
Right.
He is asking what, in objective reality, taking all global circumstances into account, is the correct action to take.
If you look at Alfred and say, well, chess says queen, morality says bishop, it's really up to which rulebook you prefer, you haven't answered his question. You've abdicated reality.
Exactly. Thomson proves that objective circumstances must carry weight. The imminent threat to millions of lives in Chicago objectively trumps the artificial rules of a board game. To say otherwise reduces normativity to a meaningless, bureaucratic game of categorization. There is an objective truth about what Alfred simply ought to do.
But we also have to be careful because we use the word ought in ways that have nothing to do with heavy moral commands. There is a secondary use called the epistemic ought.
Yes, we have to separate the predictive from the directive. Suppose you have a friend, Alan. Alan goes for a 2-mile walk every single day at 2:00 p.m. It is like clockwork. You look at your watch and it is 2:45 p.m. You say to yourself, Alan ought to be home by now.
I have an analogy for this. It's like looking at a dark, heavy cloud and saying, it ought to rain. I'm not giving the cloud a moral command. I'm not saying the cloud is a bad person if it stays dry.
That is a great analogy. You are making a non-normative expectation based on probability and past evidence. It is an epistemic judgment, epistemic meaning related to knowledge and prediction.
It is totally different from a directive like you ought to keep your promises. We must isolate the directive ought to truly understand it.
So, if we strip away the predictive ought and we strip away the relativist illusion, we are left with the ultimate core question. What does it actually mean at a factual, mechanical level to say A ought to V?
This is Thomson's grand conclusion, the directive thesis. It states that A belongs to a directive kind, and if A fails to V, it becomes a defective specimen of that kind.
We are right back to the kinds. The framework holds up perfectly.
Always back to the kinds. A toaster ought to toast. Why? Because if it doesn't, it is a physically defective toaster. A seeing eye dog ought to stop at street corners.
Why?
Because if it doesn't, it is a functionally defective seeing eye dog. The ought is simply the mechanism required to avoid defectiveness.
But what happens when the kinds conflict? What happens when biology clashes with human intervention? This leads to the quiet dog paradox, which is fascinating.
It is a brilliant stress test of the directive thesis. Imagine a specific breed of dog legally trademarked as the quiet dog. It is a terrier that has been surgically altered by a breeder so it physically cannot bark, specifically marketed to people living in apartments with strict noise ordinances.
Okay, so we have a dog named Fido. Fido is a registered quiet dog.
As a quiet dog, Fido ought to be unable to bark. If a burglar breaks in and Fido barks, Fido is a defective quiet dog. The owner would demand a refund because the product failed its specific standard.
But wait, Fido is fundamentally a terrier. Terriers are a biological kind. According to the biology of a terrier, Fido ought to be able to bark to elude the pack. If a biological terrier cannot bark, it is biologically defective.
So we have a paradox. As a quiet dog, Fido ought not to bark. As a terrier, Fido ought to bark.
How does Thomson resolve a literal biological contradiction?
She introduces the improved directive thesis, which establishes a strict hierarchy of kinds. She explains that directive superkinds always trump directive subkinds.
Superkinds trump subkinds.
Yes. Terrier is the biological superkind forged by nature and genetics. Quiet dog is merely an artificial subkind created by human intervention and surgical alteration. The norms of the superkind have supreme authority. Therefore, fundamentally, Fido is a defective terrier, even if he operates as a flawless, quiet dog.
So the biological reality trumps the artificial purpose. But here's where I have to push back on behalf of everyone listening. What does this mean for us? Humans aren't bred for a specific singular function like terriers retrieving foxes, and we certainly aren't manufactured with a purpose like a toaster. We don't have a quiet human subkind. How can you apply defectiveness to a human being?
This is the crescendo of her entire theory. For humanity, Thomson introduces the HB norm thesis, the human being norm thesis. For humans, an ought relies on whether failing to perform the action renders one a physically or mentally defective human being.
Physical makes sense. Humans ought to have 2 legs and a functioning heart. If you don't, you're physically defective in a medical sense. But how on earth does that scale up to morality? How do we jump from biological anatomy to you ought not to steal?
Because humans are not just anatomical machines. Thomson argues that the capacities for reasoning, for justice, for socialization, for basic decency are the established mental and psychological norms of the human species.
Okay, I follow.
A human being who is entirely incapable of justice or who chronically, obsessively engages in vicious cruelty is not just making a bad choice. They are exhibiting a catastrophic defect in standard human capacities. They are, in a very real factual sense, a defective human being.
So failing to be decent literally marks a defect in your humanity, exactly the same way failing to heat bread marks a defect in a toaster.
Yes, the normativity of morality is grounded in the biology and psychology of our species. And this leads to what she calls the directive constraint, which I think is the most liberating and beautiful part of Thomson's entire architecture.
Why is that?
Because she connects on to simply avoiding defect, she doesn't demand radical, impossible saintliness.
Contrast this with a philosophy like consequentialism, which is what we usually default to when we feel guilty.
Consequentialism is a punishing framework. It dictates that you must constantly maximize all global goodness. If you buy a $5 cup of coffee instead of donating that exact $5 to save a child's life overseas, consequentialism argues you have failed your moral duty. It demands total, unwavering saintliness at every moment.
Which is why everyone feels morally exhausted and guilty all the time, because it's a completely impossible standard to maintain.
Exactly. Thomson's framework offers a profound relief. It says, you are not required to be a saint to be a good human. You are only required not to be defective. It simply demands decency.
Just basic decency.
Right. It demands that you avoid the extreme vices like profound cruelty, pathological dishonesty, or complete destructive selfishness that break the mental and social norms of a functioning human being.
It grounds morality. It makes it achievable. It pulls ethics out of the realm of punishing impossible mathematics and brings it back down to the factual reality of what we actually are as a biological and social species.
It really is a sweeping, masterful synthesis. Think about what she accomplished here. She takes all these disparate, chaotic parts of human language, how we judge appliances, how we evaluate the legality of chess moves, how we argue about the quality of typewriters from 1900, how we handle the psychological torture of an eccentric billionaire offering us money to believe the earth is flat. And she unifies every single one of them
Right.
under a single mathematically coherent architecture based entirely on kinds and defectiveness.
So let's synthesize this whole incredible journey. For you listening right now, we have traveled all the way from the illusion of mystical floating goodness down to the concrete biological reality of human being norms. We've learned that normative judgments, whether you're evaluating things or directing action, are deeply, inextricably grounded in the physical world.
Absolutely.
When you make an evaluative judgment, when you look at something and say, it is good, you are simply checking it against the standards set by the kind of thing it is. Is it a good umbrella based on what umbrellas are meant to do? Is it a good mathematician based on the ceiling of mathematical potential?
And when you make a directive judgment, when you tell someone they ought to do something, you are looking at what is structurally required to avoid being a defective specimen of that kind.
Right. So the next time you evaluate a colleague's performance or review a piece of software or agonize over your own moral choices, you now have the ultimate blueprint. Ask yourself, are you judging it by the correct kind? Are you confusing a pragmatic reason for an objective one? Are you holding yourself to a standard of impossible saintliness or just the grounded standard of human decency?
It is a framework that brings immense clarity. But if we take Thomson's thesis to its ultimate logical conclusion, it actually leaves us with a rather provocative, perhaps even terrifying implication.
Oh, where does the architecture break down?
It doesn't break down, but it points to a future we really aren't prepared for. Thomson ties our moral oughts entirely to what makes a human being physically and mentally non-defective. She grounds the entirety of human morality in the biology and psychology of the human species as it currently exists.
Right, the norms of today.
But look at the world right now. We are entering an age of hyper-rapid technological evolution. We are looking down the barrel of CRISPR genetic engineering, neural implants, and deep integration with artificial intelligence. We are on the precipice of intentionally changing what the biological and mental norms of the human species actually are.
Wow.
If we fundamentally alter if we engineer a new super kind of human that processes logic like an AI or doesn't feel biological fear, do we automatically rewrite the laws of human morality? If the definition of a standard human shifts, does what we ought to do shift right along with it?
That is wild to think about.
It suggests that our ethics, which we treat as eternal, are really only as stable as our current biology.
That is a staggering paradigm shift to consider, something to seriously mull over the next time you look in the mirror, or, I don't know, the next time you ask an AI to solve a problem for you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of human judgment. We hope your diagnostic muddy waters are a little clearer now.